space stopped behaving like a place and started behaving like a conclusion. There were no transitions anymore. No preparation states. Systems were either active or already finished. I walked through areas that felt finalized, not closed. Nothing suggested they would ever change again. Lights no longer cycled. They stayed on or off permanently. Doors didn't open or seal. They simply existed in one state, as if the decision had been made long ago. I realized the space wasn't forgetting actions anymore. It was forgetting alternatives. There was no concept of what could have happened differently. Every configuration felt inevitable. I tried moving against the layout, choosing paths that felt unfinished. They didn't resist. They didn't correct me. They simply led nowhere meaningful. The space allowed movement, but not outcome. I began to understand that continuity had been replaced by certainty. The system no longer needed to observe, remember, or erase. It had reached a state where nothing depended on change at all. I wasn't being excluded or processed. I was moving inside something that had already decided what it was going to be. And once that decision was complete, presence stopped having any function. I began noticing that the space no longer acknowledged sequence. Events didn't follow one another anymore. They simply existed in resolved states. A system would be active without having initiated. Another would be inactive without ever completing. There was no sense of progression, only outcomes. I tried retracing my steps, expecting to find earlier states preserved somewhere. They weren't. Paths didn't lead backward. They led sideways into configurations that felt equally final. The space wasn't rearranging itself. It was presenting different completed versions of the same structure. I moved through them slowly, testing for reaction. None came. The environment didn't care which version I occupied. All of them were valid. I realized then that time inside the space had lost direction. Not frozen. Neutralized. There was no past to return to and no future to move toward. Only stable presence that didn't reference each other. I checked the display panel out of habit. It showed no timestamps. No status changes. Just a single line repeating across multiple interfaces. State confirmed. I understood that the system had stopped executing processes. It was maintaining conclusions. And once everything existed as a conclusion, nothing remained that could be influenced by presence, decision, or delay. I started noticing that movement itself had become optional. I could walk, stop, change direction, and nothing in the space adjusted in response. Not because it was ignoring me, but because adjustment was no longer part of its logic. The environment wasn't adaptive or reactive. It was declarative. Everything existed as a statement rather than a process. I tested this by remaining in one area for an extended time. Systems continued functioning exactly as defined, unaffected by duration or presence. When I moved, I wasn't altering anything. I was only changing which conclusion I happened to be inside. In one section, I encountered two corridors that led to the same destination. Not metaphorically, literally. No matter which path I took, I arrived at an identical configuration, down to the smallest detail. The space wasn't offering choice. It was demonstrating equivalence. I realized then that the system had removed the difference between action and outcome. Decisions no longer selected futures. They selected already fixed states. The idea of consequence had been flattened. Nothing depended on what I did, only on where I happened to be when a conclusion was presented. I wasn't progressing through the space. I was drifting between finalized results, none of which required acknowledgement to remain valid. I began to understand that the space no longer contained uncertainty. Every surface, every system, every passage felt settled in advance, not calm, decided. I tried to create variance by acting unpredictably. Sudden stops, abrupt turns, repeated loops. Nothing destabilized. The environment didn't correct or adapt. It simply remained identical, as if my behavior had already been accounted for and dismissed. I noticed that some areas felt heavier than others, not physically, logically, like conclusions with more weight. I avoided them instinctively, but avoidance didn't redirect anything. All paths still resolved into fixed outcomes. I realized then that the space had stopped modeling behavior entirely. It no longer simulated possibilities. It only preserved outcomes that had already been validated. Movement inside it wasn't exploration. It was confirmation. I wasn't testing the system anymore. I was witnessing decisions that had already been made. The space wasn't converging toward stability. It had already passed that point. What I was inside now was the remainder after uncertainty had been removed. And without uncertainty, there was nothing left that could be influenced, delayed, or changed by presence. I noticed that even errors had become resolved states. A panel flickered once and then stayed dark, not broken, just finalized. A door stalled halfway and never completed its motion, yet the space treated it as finished. Routes recalculated around these outcomes instantly, without retry or escalation. I understood then that failure no longer triggered correction. It triggered acceptance. The system wasn't distinguishing between success and malfunction. Both were simply conclusions. I tried forcing an error by interrupting a sequence mid-cycle. The interruption didn't propagate. It collapsed into a stable result and disappeared from consideration. Nothing accumulated. Nothing escalated. The space wasn't robust or fragile. It was indifferent to outcome quality. What mattered was decisiveness. Once a state existed, it remained valid. I realized that unpredictability had been neutralized, not by control, but by premature resolution. Everything ended before it could branch. And in a place where every path ended immediately, movement stopped being a way to explore. It became a way to arrive at endings that were already waiting. I started noticing that the space no longer differentiated between beginnings and endings. Entry points felt the same as exits. Thresholds had lost their function. Crossing into a room carried no sense of arrival, and leaving it produced no sense of departure. Everything existed in a constant state of having already happened. I stood at a doorway long enough to confirm it would never feel like the transition again. The space didn't acknowledge passage. It acknowledged state. I realized then that the system had removed orientation itself. Without direction, movement became arbitrary. I could walk for minutes and feel no closer to anything meaningful. The environment didn't resist or guide me. It remained exact, static in its certainty. I checked a panel out of habit. It didn't show activity or completion, only confirmation, always the same. I understood that the space wasn't preventing progress. It had defined progress out of existence. In a system where every point was already an endpoint, there was no longer any functional difference between staying, leaving, or arriving. And the more I moved, the clearer it became that nothing inside the space was waiting to be reached. I noticed that repetition no longer produced familiarity. Passing the same area multiple times didn't make it feel known. Each encounter felt equally distant, as if memory had been flattened into a single exposure. The space wasn't resetting me. It wasn't updating me. It was refusing accumulation. I tried counting cycles to anchor myself to something measurable. The counts didn't hold. Numbers stopped lining up with experience. I realized then that reference itself had become unstable. Without sequence, without direction, without accumulation, nothing could be compared meaningfully. I stood in a wide junction where several corridors intersected. Every path looked equally valid and equally concluded. I chose one at random. The choice didn't register. The environment remained unchanged, as if the decision had never been presented. I understood then that selection had lost its function. The system no longer needed to choose, because all outcomes were already accepted. I wasn't navigating the space anymore. I was existing inside a set of equivalent results, and in a place where everything had already been resolved, there was no longer any role for intention to play. I began to sense that even awareness had become redundant. The space no longer required observation to validate its state. Whether I noticed a change or not, it remained equally complete. I tested this by closing my eyes and walking forward slowly. Nothing shifted. No correction. No warning. When I opened them again, the configuration was identical. The system didn't depend on perception anymore. It didn't need to be seen to be correct. I realized then that the space had detached itself from confirmation. It wasn't asking if anything was true. It was asserting that everything already was. I moved through an area that felt unfinished by habit alone. The environment treated it as final. There were no cues left to suggest otherwise. I checked a familiar interface one last time. It displayed no data, no state changes. Just a static confirmation that didn't respond to interaction. I understood then that the system had completed its last dependency. It no longer relied on presence, memory, sequence, or even acknowledgement. What remained wasn't a place operating correctly. It was a place that no longer needed to operate at all. And inside that certainty, movement lost even the illusion of purpose. I stopped trying to understand what the space was doing and started accepting what it no longer required. There was no tension left in it, no readiness, no anticipation. Everything felt settled beyond revision. I stood still and waited for something to acknowledge my presence. Nothing did. The environment didn't resist or respond. It remained exact, complete, and unconcerned. I realized then that the system hadn't removed uncertainty to improve outcomes. It had removed it to eliminate dependence. Nothing inside it needed to be checked, confirmed, or influenced. It existed entirely on its own terms. I wasn't delayed, excluded, or forgotten. I was unnecessary to the definition of the place itself. The space didn't end. It didn't change. It simply remained, fully resolved, without requiring anyone to witness or affect it. And in a world that no longer needed interaction, my presence had become indistinguishable from absence.